Wants to get in touch with me, go to the SVAS website, and I'm the guy with the red shirt. So I'm easy to find. So I will start my presentation unless there's any other questions about outreach or the club in general. Okay. Yep, I got it. All right, there we go. So my talk today is called Red Star Over the Moon, and it is about Apollo's competition in the 1960s from the Soviet Union. We're all familiar with what Apollo did, but a lot of people don't know what the Soviets were up to at the same time. And for those folks that are under 40, the Soviet Union was the world's largest country, and it existed for most of the 20th century. And I do want to point this fact out because it'll be critical to what happened with the moon effort. In 1970, the US had a $1 trillion economy. The Soviet economy was about 40% the size of ours. And I want you to remember that factor when I start talking about some of the things that we were both doing to try to land on the moon. And it was a very political and military space race too to land a person on the moon, because back then we were in an arms race with the Soviet Union, and that included nuclear weapons. And that's again a critical point that we have to bring up as we talk about the space race of the 50s and 60s. So from 1961 to 1969, there was a race between us and the Soviets to land the first man on the moon. And the Soviets were into it. This is one of their cosmonauts who said, I can positively state that the Soviet Union will not be beaten by the US in a race for a human being to go to the moon. And he said that in 1966, 3 years before Apollo 11 landed. We do know how this ended though, and the United States did land 6 missions to the moon between 1968 and 1972. We also had 2 orbital test flights before the landings. And of course, we had Apollo 13, which was a failed landing attempt, but thankfully we rescued the crew and got them back home. Great movie, by the way. 2 dates I want you to also remember. December 1968, Apollo 8 was the first mission from the United States that orbited people around the moon. And Apollo 11, which was the first landing on the moon in July 1969. And the Soviets acknowledged our victory. They said they congratulated the United States, and they invited Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, to the Soviet Union. In 1970, he visited government officials as well as cosmonauts. But interestingly enough, the Soviet Union denied they were ever in a race. And they also kind of said, yeah, this wasn't a cool thing to do anyway. So, propaganda of the time. But the question is, were they really denying a race? And we'll talk about that. Space travel in the 50s and 60s was tied to the military. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated an atomic bomb 4 years after we detonated ours. And at the time, the only way to drop a weapon was using a bomber, and that took several hours to fly between countries. So both sides are developing intercontinental ballistic missiles that could deliver a weapon in 30 minutes to an adversary. And the Soviets came up with the R-7 Semyorka, which actually was a pretty lousy missile. It took 20 hours to get ready and could only be ready for a day. So if you have a missile coming in less than 30 minutes, you're not going to spend 20 hours getting your missile ready. But the R-7 was an excellent launch vehicle. That being said, there's a couple key players. Nikita Khrushchev ran the Soviet Union from 53 to 64. And there was a man named Sergei Korolev who was a chief designer in one of their bureaus. The Soviets had design bureaus throughout their government that would make rockets or other military applications. Khrushchev was interested in ICBMs. He was interested in launching rockets. And his partner at the time, Glushko, was an excellent engine designer. And both of them built the R-7. And they convinced Khrushchev to launch a satellite for the 57-58 geophysical year. And they launched Sputnik 1, which shocked the whole world. Because the United States suddenly felt, oh my gosh, they could drop a weapon on us in 30 minutes. And you could see Sputnik flying over the sky. It also had a radio transmitter you could pick up with it with a shortwave radio. We decided to respond. At the time, NASA didn't exist, so we had the Navy and the Army trying to put up a satellite. Well, the naval effort blew up on international TV on a launch pad. Very embarrassing. The Soviet Union offered, at the UN, they offered if the United States wanted help to developing countries. To developing, yeah, seriously, this was a really bad news for the U.S. The Army tried in February of '58 and actually launched a satellite successfully. And this guy, Wernher von Braun, was leading the effort. Like Korolev, he was trying to force the U.S. government to do space research because the U.S. government, like the Soviets, was interested in military applications. And him and Korolev had kind of a parallel effort going on to do that. Well, the Soviets kept winning in the space race. They launched the first animal into space. They launched the first probe to fly by the moon, the first probe to hit the moon, the first probe to image the far side. They had the first probe to fly by Venus, and we were behind. They kept winning. Eisenhower, who was president in the 50s, decided to make space a civilian effort. Because again, it was similar to the Soviet Union. You had military departments trying to do satellite launches. So he created NASA, which was a civilian space industry. And guess who he selected as one of his leaders? Wernher von Braun. He led the Marshall Space Flight Center and became the chief architect of the Saturn V, which put people on the moon. However, at this time, the Soviets kept winning again. They launched the first man into space, into low Earth orbit, and that was Yuri Gagarin in 1961 aboard that spacecraft on the right called the Vostok 1. First generation spacecraft, couldn't do a lot except go into orbit and come back home. But again, a huge technological breakthrough. The US responded by only going up and coming right back down and flying for a total of 15 minutes. The Soviets had done a full orbit. We did 2 flights like this, and it wasn't until a year later, almost a year later, that John Glenn did the first orbital mission of an American aboard Friendship 7. And we did 6 of these Mercury flights with 1 astronaut. And again, first generation spacecraft couldn't do much than go into low Earth orbit and come back down. It could not change orbit or do any of those fancy maneuvers that you need to go to the moon. Well, President Kennedy was not happy about this. And in 1961, he gave probably what, in my opinion, is one of the best mission statements a president ever said. If you look at it, it is perfect for setting a goal. He said in May of '61, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal. And he's talking about a national effort, this nation. Before this decade is out, a firm timeline of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely. Again, a solid goal. No single space project will be more exciting or more impressive to mankind or more important. This is a top priority of the US government. And none will be so difficult, we all know it's going to be not easy, or expensive to accomplish. And to pull this off by the mid-60s, NASA was consuming 4.5% of the federal budget. And when you have $1 trillion economy, you can afford to do that. So what wound up happening is, and this is a critical thing to discuss also, is NASA kept functioning as a top-down organization. Kennedy appointed James Webb, who the telescope's named after, to run NASA during the space race. And he was the head administrator of the Apollo program. And of course, von Braun was the chief architect of the hardware. And the Soviets had government bureaus designing and building hardware. What NASA did is they picked private aerospace companies to do the work. There was virtually no competition except for bidding. So NASA would put out a proposal to say, we need this space probe built or this engine built. Companies would bid, NASA would pick the bidder, and then that bidder was in charge to do the hardware completely. The Soviets had a very different approach, and this is what cost them, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But with the lowest bidder, John Glenn summed it up well, where he said, as I hurtled through space, one thought kept crossing my mind. Every part of the rocket was supplied by the lowest bidder. Uh, Yeah, and I've worked in this field. I can tell you stories about that someday, but so America came out of the gate running. All right. We sent probes to the moon to study it. We began the Gemini program to test procedures and hardware in space. And they began designing and testing the hardware to go to the moon straight away. I mean, the moment Kennedy said that, Congress paid the money and we were out of the gate. The Russians kept pushing us, though. The Vostok program, again, was a single piloted spacecraft, and they had, like us, 6 launches. They had the first men in space, of course. They had 2 Vostoks flying simultaneously, but because it's a first generation spacecraft, they could not maneuver around each other. They had the longest solo flight of almost 5 days, and they had the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. We didn't put a woman in space until 20 years later with Sally Ride in 1983 with the space shuttle. And here's the political issues. And you could write a whole book about Soviet political issues in the space race because administrative guidance is critical in these kind of efforts. And I mentioned what NASA did, top-down administration, and then they would pick a contractor to build specific hardware. And the only competition happened when they were doing their bids. Soviets, on the other hand, didn't begin an effort like us out of the gate. They told Korolev to start engineering studies of building a moon rocket. At the same time, they told another design bureau to do a lunar flyby rocket with a cosmonaut. So he's looking at developing a rocket to land people on the moon. He's developing a rocket to fly by the moon, separate architecture. And this was very common in the Soviet bureaucracy. The Soviet government did not want power concentrated in these government design bureaus, so they intentionally pitted them against each other and would try to keep design bureaus from not having over influence on the Soviet government. And Glushko, who designed the R7 with him, well, they hated each other. He was a top rocket engine designer, and he renounced Korolev to Stalin and wound up sending Korolev off to the Gulag. So Korolev didn't have a very nice opinion of Glushkov. So you had the best rocket engineer in the Soviet Union, the best engine designer in the Soviet Union, not talking to each other. So Korolev had no choice but to pick a different bureau for his engines, and he picked Kuznetsov, who was a jet engine designer. And the problem is he was a fine engineer for jet engines, but he was lacking in experience with rocket engines. So remember that too as we go on. The next spacecraft that the Soviets did was called the Voskhod, and that was still a first generation spacecraft. It could not maneuver or change orbit. They took a Vostok spacecraft, gutted the inside, and launched 3 cosmonauts in it. Again, another first, a multi-crew flight before we did in October 64. These guys had no spacesuits and no escape system because they had to shed as much weight as they could to get these guys into orbit. The next mission was called Vostok 2 in March 65, 2 crew members this time. And they did this again, they beat us again. First spacewalk. Alexei Leonov put on a spacesuit and went outside of the spacecraft. If you ever want to read space history, this is a great mission to study. Alexei Leonov almost died because his spacesuit became overpressurized. It became like a balloon and he couldn't maneuver to get back into the capsule. He had to release almost all the pressure out of the spacesuit to get back into the Vostok capsule or Vostok sphere. And what's wild is they re-entered over 200 miles off course into a remote Russian forest. They couldn't find or rescue them for 2 days. And they had wolves at night circling their spacecraft. It's a really neat story. I recommend you study it. And as a result of this mission and his bravery, Alexei Leonov became one of the top cosmonauts. And he became a real diplomat with the Americans in the future. I know somebody that knew him personally, great guy. and he would have likely been the first man on the moon if the Soviets pulled off a landing. Now, Voskhod was still a first-generation spacecraft. The Americans developed the Gemini program, where they had 2 crew members going into space, and this was a second-generation spacecraft because it could change orbit. And if you're landing on the moon, changing orbits is essential. We did 10 flights. We tested everything, including a 2-week stay in space to test how the human body reacts to space and how machines react in space. And we had a true rendezvous mission. 2 Gemini capsules simultaneously flew next to each other and maneuvered around each other. They didn't dock, but this kind of maneuverability is critical when you have a lunar flight. And then on Gemini 8, we did the first docking with a uncrewed vehicle that was launched. So Neil Armstrong and David Scott docked with the Agena target vehicle in Earth orbit. And this is the moment when we leapfrogged the Soviet Union as far as being ahead in the space race. And this is a critical time because the Kremlin kind of woke up to this, and they weren't taking America as seriously as they should have. But at this point, they woke up and said, oh, wait a minute, Kennedy was serious. And I won't go into details here, but all of us sent robotic probes. We had several failures, but we did soft land on the moon. We also had orbiters, and the Soviet Union had 12 landing attempts with a probe. 10 of them failed, but their first landing attempt with a probe beat ours by 5 months. So they're still trying to, beat us, and they were successful at having firsts again. And our philosophy was build a Saturn V, and this architecture would do any lunar mission with people, orbital, landing, etc., and send 3 guys. And we would send 2 spacecraft, a command and service module orbiter, and a dedicated lander. And the procedure is called lunar orbit rendezvous. We would send up this pair of spacecraft using the Saturn V. 1 astronaut stayed in the orbiter and orbited the moon. 2 astronauts went into the lander. The orbiter orbits, the lander lands. The astronauts do their business on the moon, collect rocks, plant the flag. And then the bottom of the lander was used to descend to the moon. The top of the lander took off, went back to lunar orbit, docked with the command module. They would dump the lunar orbiter when the 2 guys rejoined their crewmate in the orbiter, and they flew home. Soviets had a similar plan, which I'll go over. And we were going gung-ho with ground tests. So in 1967, we had a successful test flight of an unmanned Saturn V. We had a successful test flight in 1968 of an unmanned lunar lander. We were testing all the systems using robotic rockets, and we were testing our engines like crazy. So again, 4.5% of the federal budget of a $1 trillion economy, you can do all this, and we did. So what happened with the Soviets in 1965? Sorry, in 1964, 3 years after Kennedy, the Central Committee finally said, we want to do a lunar landing. And they told Korolev, with your N-1 rocket, land a cosmonaut on the moon between 1968 and 1970. So the Soviets had 6 years, we had 9. And also this guy, Khalomi, was assigned to accomplish a lunar orbital mission by 1967 using a different architecture. And again, the United States picked one architecture for both types of missions. Khrushchev was ousted and Brezhnev took over in 64, which kind of caused turmoil. And there was turmoil because Khrushchev's son was working with this guy. So of course, with the bureaus fighting each other, that caused turmoil. And then Korolev died in 1966 during a botched operation. So their lead rocket engineer died during this effort, and that was a huge blow to the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, Korolev's deputy was not skilled as a manager like Korolev was. Korolev was a brilliant manager, and Mission, his name was Mission, could not do Korolev's job as well, which again was critical when you're trying to work in this bureaucracy. And the Soviets were working on a second generation spacecraft like Gemini called Soyuz. And they were developing it in the 60s, but they were having lots of problems. The design would seat up to three cosmonauts, and they had a military version, an Earth orbit version, and a lunar version. Because of resource tightness, the military version got the most funding. They were having trouble getting all the funding they needed for the lunar version. And they had uncrewed test flights in the mid 60s, which had lots of problems, lots of failures. They were having a lot of growing pains with the Soyuz. I mean, now this is a very developed vehicle. This is their workhorse for putting people in space, but it had a lot of growing pains in the 60s. And both sides were rushing headlong to do this. And because of that, there was a tragedy in 67 for both us and the Soviets. In January, we lost three astronauts during a ground test of the Apollo 1 rocket in 1967 when a fire broke out in the capsule, and all three of these men died. The Soviets had a tragedy as well in April of that year. The first Soyuz was launched with Vladimir Koromov to do a test flight in Earth orbit. The Soyuz had lots of problems on its mission, and they said, you have to come home early. We're having problems, come back. And the parachute malfunctioned, and Komarov died because he couldn't decelerate and impacted the Earth at free fall speed. So both sides had tragedies of losing brave astronauts and a brave cosmonaut during this time because we were rushing to get to the moon. And this suspended all manned flights until October of 68 for both sides. So for over a year, both sides lost the ability to launch astronauts into Earth orbit. And when you're trying to research this stuff, that was a big hit for schedule. So this is the Zond mission, which is supposed to be an orbital mission. And this is the closest they came to beating us again. It was basically a modified Soyuz that could carry up to two cosmonauts. It was supposed to orbit or go swing around the moon and come back. They had 12 uncrewed flights. 4 went around the moon, but again with no crew. And they had many failures, including reentry failures. So it never carried a person. If they had worked out some of these engineering issues, they could have possibly beat us to an Apollo 8 style mission of orbiting people around the moon. And again, reentry was one of their biggest problems. In 1968 in September, that was their first mission. It carried turtles. I don't know why. And they transmitted a tape recording of cosmonaut voices. NASA was, of course, monitoring this, and they heard the voice transmission. They said, they beat us again, right? But again, when it came back, they realized it was uncrewed. And of course, this was in September of 68. We didn't fly Apollo 8 until December of that year to send the first people orbiting the moon. I'll talk briefly about rocket staging, but anytime a rocket goes up, it takes a lot of fuel to break off the launch pad and then to get into Earth orbit through the atmosphere. So rockets will dump stages. And this is a Saturn V, which took 3 stages to get into Earth orbit and send the spacecraft to the moon. And so as it's flying up in the air, of course, it dumps a stage. So the higher it gets, it burns all the fuel in the stage and it dumps that stage. And eventually, like this part right here is the only part that got into Earth orbit. And that's a very common thing to do with rockets. This is the N1 rocket, which Korolev was designing to do a lunar landing. And it's comparable in size to the Saturn V that we use for Apollo. However, it wasn't as capable. We could send over 100,000 pounds to the moon. The N1 could only do a little over 50,000 pounds. One thing about Russian-Soviet history is there's a saying that the Soviets know how to play a bad hand well. And they certainly did. You know, even though they had a rocket that had half the capacity, they actually developed a way of making it work. And it was similar to ours. They would launch a Soyuz orbiter derivative, and they would launch a lander craft as well, and also a decelerating engine, and I'll talk about that. So the plan was 2 cosmonauts, not 3, and again, a 2 spacecraft delivery system. So The philosophy was also different. Remember how Glushkov would not work with Korolev on engines? The United States had a philosophy of making big engines on our moon rocket. This is the working end of a Saturn V, and this is the stage that takes it off the launch pad. 5 giant 1.5 million pound thrust engines to lift a 6.5 million pound rocket into space. The Soviets took a very different approach. 30 small engines on their first stage. Does that look familiar? Starship. Elon Musk has a similar actual philosophy in more ways than one than the Soviets. Uh, of course, the architecture is different in that these engines do what's called gimbaling. The Soviets didn't gimbal their engines. Gimbaling is where you swing an engine to steer the spacecraft. The Soviets didn't gimbal. They would change the thrust value of their engines to steer the spacecraft. And then they had 4 stages to go into orbit or to the moon versus R3. And of course, they had less and less engines with each stage because you're dumping mass and don't need as much power to go. And this was their plan. So you have, like us, on the right, you have the Soyuz orbiter, and you have the lander here with a booster. On the American plan, there was a tunnel between the 2 spacecraft that astronauts could use to go between the lander and the orbiter. Soviets, because weight was much more critical, would spacewalk between the 2 spacecraft. So one cosmonaut would stay in the orbiter, and the other cosmonaut would spacewalk into the lander. So the lander would undock, and the orbiter would stay in lunar orbit, just like our command module did for Apollo. To decelerate to the moon, the Soviet version had a booster engine on the bottom to burn energy and slow down. Once they got within 5 kilometers of the moon, they would dump the booster, and the engine on the lander would be used to finally take it down to the surface. The American version did not have a booster. This bottom part of the lunar module for Apollo was used to take it all the way down to the surface of the moon. So then the cosmonaut would land, do the usual ceremonies, put up a flag, collect moon rocks, etc. And then they would blast off to the moon, to lunar orbit. Here's a key design difference. On the American spacecraft, the engine that was used to land was never used again. The top part of the lander would have its own dedicated engine to go back to lunar orbit. The Soviet version used the exact same engine to take off again and only leave the leg tripods on the lunar surface. They were trying to save weight. They had a backup engine as well, but here's the problem. Here's the scary part. If you land and crunch that nozzle, you're stuck. And this is Apollo 15 where they crunched the descent nozzle. But thankfully, again, they had a dedicated engine to take off, and this wasn't used. So they had a much riskier flight plan because of that. And then, of course, the lunar lander would fly back to orbit. It would dock with the Soyuz. And then the cosmonaut would spacewalk back to the orbiter. They would dump the lander. And then they would use the orbiter to go back to Earth. And that was the plan. So these are scale photographs of our lander on the right and the Soviet lander on the left. It was shorter than the Apollo lander, and it was 1/3 the weight. There were differences, of course. They landed a single cosmonaut. They wanted to land a single cosmonaut. We landed 2 astronauts. Our engine was much more powerful because we had a heavier spacecraft. And again, we had 2 engines. They had 1 engine. The Apollo version could fly for 75 hours. The Soviet one for 48. We had a very advanced guidance computer, and we were ahead of the Soviets as far as computer tech back then. And the guidance computer on Apollo could take the spacecraft from lunar orbit to landing completely automatically. The last segment, the astronauts always had an excuse to take manual control. And, some excuses were really good. Some were like, yeah, you're a pilot, you want to fly it, I get it. But the Soviets, on the other hand, didn't have the advanced technology we did. They had a guidance calculator. And there was a lot more task on the astronaut to be able to land that spacecraft on the moon. They both use hypergolic propellants, which are fuels that ignite on contact. That makes the engine a lot simpler. Here's the key difference. They had a backup engine, a smaller backup engine if that one got damaged, but that was, iffy sometimes. We had no backup engine. And this one is interesting. I had some data on this. The way we fed the fuel into our engine was pressure. They used turbopumps. So you have turbopumps trying to push the fuel and oxidizer to get an ignition in the engine. I was talking to a colleague where I work who worked on turbopumps, and he said, yeah, the Soviets actually had some significant advantages over us in turbopump technology. We didn't want to use turbopumps because of the risk that they malfunction. They were comfortable with that. And they actually did make significant advances in turbopump technology back in the 60s. Both used landing radar, and the Apollo module could hover for about 2 minutes trying to find a landing spot, the Soviet for about 50 seconds. And they were both battery powered, which is actually what you want to do. You're only flying for a couple days. Batteries are sure things. You don't want to have anything that could fail. And they actually test flew their lander, their LK lander. They did 3 unmanned test flights, but where they went into Earth orbit and practiced all the systems. Again, unmanned. Notice something. Look at the dates. 1970, 1971. Apollo 11 landed in November of 69. July of 69. They didn't do their first autonomous test flight of their lander till at least a year after we landed. So they were absolutely in the race to try to get to the moon. It's just that because of that delay of responding to Kennedy's speech, they lost a lot of critical time. And the lander was very successful. They actually cleared it for human flight. It did its job in low Earth orbit. And what's amazing is these landers went into a really high orbit around the Earth, and the last one burned up 24 years after launch. So they stayed up there for a long time. And here's the kicker. We didn't know about this till the late 80s. Again, because the Soviets kept denying that they were in a race, but obviously they were if they're testing lunar hardware. And there was stuff that was making us really nervous. This is a reconnaissance satellite photo from September of 68 that was unclassified not that long ago. And this is an N1 rocket, or what we thought was an N1 rocket, on the launch pad in the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. And the Americans are like, they're going to try to shoot for the moon. And this added pressure for us to do Apollo 8 orbiting and Apollo 11 landing. What they didn't realize was this was not a flight vehicle, it was a mock-up to test the launch pad facilities. But we couldn't tell. We thought maybe this is a real rocket. And this is it. This is a real photograph of the N1 moon rocket and it being manufactured. They did 4 test flights. Again, no crews, thankfully, but they did 4 test flights. First one was in 1969. And 70 seconds after launch, they had severe vibrations that took out fuel lines and caused a fire and explosion. They tried again in July of 69, a couple weeks before we landed on the moon, and it blew up on the launch pad and completely destroyed the launch facility. They tried again in 71, and 50 seconds into the flight, the computer could not control the rocket and it began rolling, and aerodynamic forces tore it apart. And November 72, right before we had our last manned lunar mission, they actually got it to fly for 107 seconds. They were staging, they were getting ready to dump the first stage, and the loads from the first stage being uncoupled caused loads to damage the rocket and cause a fire and, again, another failure. But the thing is, they were making progress because by the 4th flight, they had figured out a lot of the bugs in the first 3 flights. And again, I'll ask the question, does this sound familiar? Think about Musk, he had his 5th flight of the Super Heavy. He tends to take this philosophy. And the reason the Soviets did this is they didn't have the means to do a lot of ground testing. So they had the philosophy of build it, fly it, let's see what happens. And they did end the program after this, but they actually were making progress. So here's why it failed. First issue is, again, lack of resources. We were testing our engines left and right for Apollo. The Soviets could not test each engine. They didn't have the means to do it because of the cost. So they would only test a sample. I've read 1 out of 6 engines or 1 out of 3. But nevertheless, most of these engines were fired for the first time during flight. The thing is too, they didn't gimbal their engines. Apollo would swing its engines to steer the Saturn V. They would shift the thrust around in their engines to try to steer it. When you gimbal an engine, you get a pretty fast response. Changing thrust, that's a bit more inertia that you try to deal with to try to shift it around. They had a very simple computer trying to run this whole show. If one engine went out because of the variable thrust, they'd have to take out another engine. So a one engine shutdown actually shut down 2 engines, and they could only lose 4 engines that way. And the computer was very cutting edge. It had its own problems too when they were trying to develop that. So how did the Soviets wrap up their program? Well, they did return to flight in 1968 with Soyuz 3. And as we know, the Soyuz became a very capable spacecraft. Again, it's been the workhorse of now Russian spacefaring since this time. They did actually a docking of 2 spacecraft in space in 1969. Again, this is a critical thing to figure out when you're going to the moon. And as they discovered that they were not catching up to us, they shifted their focus onto space stations, and they launched, again, they had the first space station in 1971, which was called Soyuz. Apollo 17 in December of 72 was the last lunar mission that we did. And we also changed our focus in 73. We launched our own space station with Skylab, and then of course we focused on the space shuttle. And by 1974, the Soviet Union said, you know what, we lost the space race, and we're going to cancel the N1 moon rocket. And this is sad because space historians would love to get a hand on this hardware. They destroyed all the hardware for the N1 rocket, and that's when they began denying that they never were part of a moon race. So the moon race ended basically, in the early 70s. The Soviet Union never tried again. And currently, the United States is the only country to have successfully landed a human on the moon over 50 years ago. And the Soviets kept having more firsts. They actually had quite a good effort in space travel in the 70s. They had 10 probes that were sent to the moon to land. 7 were successful. They actually had 2 returned lunar samples of soil back to Earth robotically, which is pretty cool. They had the first lunar rovers, and they had the first probe land on Venus and send photographs in the 70s. And so the question is, given what we just talked about, the economic efforts, the engineering efforts, et cetera, could the Soviets have beaten us to the moon in our timeline? Well, the first question is, was our success guaranteed? And it certainly was not. We had significant technical challenges that could have easily delayed our program, and we did work them through, but they were substantial issues that we had. And the Soviets were counting on us having a stall. They didn't think that we could necessarily meet the goal of Kennedy. They thought maybe it'll stretch out into the 70s. And if you think about it, let's think about the Apollo missions. Apollo 1 had a fatal fire. Apollo 11 landed with less than 40 seconds of fuel left. If they had lost any more fuel, they would have aborted and gone straight back to lunar orbit without a landing. Apollo 12 in late 1969 got hit by lightning at launch. The lightning bolt knocked out the computer control of the capsule, but it missed the guidance computer on the Saturn V, and the Saturn V rocket kept flying because it was unhurt and it kept doing its job. They finally did a reboot of the command module. The command was SCE to aux, and it basically rebooted everything, and they got their computers back. That flight could easily have been a launch abort if the lightning bolt went a little bit differently. 1970, we had Apollo 13. So with a slight change in scenario, we could have easily been delayed past Kennedy's goal. Now, given the larger economy, the more top-down vision, we had a fair chance of meeting it, but it was not guaranteed. So in our timeline, could the Soviets have beaten us? The N-1, the Soyuz, and the LK were not significantly developed by 1969 for a realistic chance of beating Apollo 11. And we saw that because their first test flights of the module to land on the moon were in 1971. A Zond flight where they wanted to send 2 cosmonauts to go around the moon, they could have possibly pulled that off and beaten Apollo 8 if they had figured out some of their engineering bugs. That was a real possibility of them getting another first. I don't think they could have done a landing, but they certainly could have done an orbital mission to beat Apollo 8. And if Apollo in general was stalled past 1970, that could have justified the Soviets putting more resources into the N-1. And with now that their architecture was riskier, but with more time, they could have reduced that risk too with development. So if they continued with the N-1 past 72, they could have possibly done a landing in the mid-70s. And another thing that if they didn't do was the rushing of the Soyuz 1. If they had spent more time and resources and avoided the tragic death of cosmonaut Komarov, they could have gained some more time too. But let's get 1.21 gigawatts of power, a stainless steel DeLorean, and go back to 1960. All right. Could there have been a red star over the moon? So, how to improve your odds? Perhaps copy the Americans. Centralized space effort organization in the 1950s. If they had done what Eisenhower did and not done the design bureau rivalry, that would have helped tremendously. Appoint Korolev with the same role as Wernher von Braun of being chief architect for lunar missions. So stop the parallel competition between design bureaus. Respond to Kennedy's speech in 1961. Don't wait 3 years to finally say we're going to land on the moon. Those 3 years were critical that were lost. Design one class of rocket. Don't do the Zond and the N-1. Do what we did. Saturn V, orbital mission, landing mission, does it all. Again, because you're spending resources. Make Vosk-Hod a true second generation spacecraft. Because when we were practicing Gemini to do orbital maneuvers, rendezvous docking, they were still setting up first generation spacecraft. Somehow, magically, make Korolev and Glushkov play nice. I don't know how they could have pulled that off, but and make sure Korolev does not die in 1966. And then apply more substantial engineering and economic resources for test and research, especially early on. Improve quality control measures and safety. One of the reasons they lost an N-1 was they had what's called FOD, foreign object debris, which went into the turbopump, caused the turbopump to fail, caused the engine to explode, and took off the stage. So they could have won, possibly, if they had a significant cultural shift in Soviet politics and administration. How realistic is that? I'd say not very, but that's the scenario, in my humble opinion, of how they could have possibly won the space race. Basically, if they copied our efforts, they probably had a much better chance of winning, the moon landing. So there were some good fruits that came out of the space race, though. In 1975, there was the Apollo-Soyuz mission, and this is the mission patch. I was 6 years old when I watched this on TV. My parents turned on the launch of the Saturn 1B that took 3 American cosmonauts to low Earth orbit. 3 American astronauts to low Earth orbit, and 2 Soviet cosmonauts to low Earth orbit. We had 3 astronauts in the American Apollo Command and Service module, and 2 Soviet cosmonauts in the Soyuz module. They docked in space, and it was actually a really nice thawing of the Cold War. And guess who the commander of the Soyuz was? Alexei Leonov, first spacewalker. And likely person to walk on the moon if the Soviets landed. And Leonov was also an artist. This painting that you see of the Apollo-Soyuz mission was painted by Alexei Leonov. And we did continue cooperation with the Soviet Union, which again was another fruit of the space race. In the 90s, we did send a shuttle to dock with their Mir space station. And the Soviets had, excuse me, the Russians have been a partner with us in a space station. And Mir was a Russian space station, not Soviet, because this is after the Soviet Union collapsed. However, in 2020, things have really gone south between cooperation with the United States and the Russians. We are going back to the moon, and NASA began what's called the Artemis program, and there's a thing called the Artemis Accords, where there's over 40 nations right now that are partnering with us to send people back to the moon. If you look at these flags, do you notice what's missing? There's no Russian flag. Russia and China have created their own consortium called the ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station Consortium. And there are 13 countries right now that are also saying they will land a person on the moon. The space race is back on. And we're planning to land with Artemis in a couple years. They want to land in 2030. We're both heading to the South Pole because that's where the water is. So things will get interesting in the next decade. And unfortunately, our partnership with Russia has pretty much fallen apart.